Welcome, everybody. Hope you're all got in. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm Chief Content Officer here at RealClearPolitics. And today we're going to talk a bit about patriotism, and in particular about a recent poll on the subject conducted by RealClear Opinion Research. So joining us today are Carl Cannon. He's Washington Bureau Chief for RealClearPolitics. John Della Volpe, who is Director of Polling at RealClear Opinion Research, and he actually conducted the poll. And Sean Trende, RCP's Senior Election Analyst. So, John, let's just dive right in. Let's start with you. How did you define patriotism for purposes of the poll? And also give us an overview of what you've learned, as well as some background on the methodology used behind the poll.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, folks, for joining us today. To set the table, the poll was conducted online. And the reason that we conducted it online is that we had a robust sample of more than 1,700 American voters. And we made sure that this was a representative sample that looks like the 2022 electorate. The other reason that we conduct the survey online is that so we can show images, just not ask questions, but we can show images in a variety of different ways to really kind of tease out how American voters are thinking about politics, about patriotism to the greatest extent possible. The poll was conducted right before the 4th of July. And I think there were two or three real quick top lines, Andy, to answer your question about what it means to be patriotic. It really depends upon who you ask. So overall, we have almost 9 in 10, 85% of the voting public considers themselves to be either very or somewhat patriotic. Okay, but there are very specific differences, as we can see on the slide, based on the kind of the intensity around the idea of being very patriotic. We can see here very briefly that men consider themselves to be more patriotic than women. We certainly see a significant generation gap with baby boomers and the silent generation. Baby boomers, in this poll, essentially folks in their late 50s and older, much more patriotic. 2/3 of them consider themselves to be very, very patriotic. We do see some differences based on race and ethnicity. No difference. This is one of the common things I found throughout this poll. There's really no difference based upon the level of education. So 55% of college graduates consider themselves to be very patriotic, and 53% of American voters who did not attend or did not graduate from a four-year college say the same. And perhaps not surprising, 2/3 of Republicans consider themselves to be very patriotic. 40% of Democrats put themselves in that category. So that's kind of how people think about themselves in terms of the label that they associate. Okay, but then we asked about a series of activities. And we found about 7 or 8 key activities that about a majority of America link very, very quickly to patriotism. Okay. Number one is voting. 90%, really no difference based on party ID. Consider that to be patriotic, very, local or presidential election. Thanking a service member, flying the American flag, of which I think about 45% of Americans indicate they had done that in the last year. Wearing a mask while in public to prevent spread of COVID. 3 in 4 American voters consider that to be a patriotic act. Engaging in community service, receiving at least 1 dose of the COVID vaccine, serving on a jury. Those are the essential 7 or 8 elements that we asked in this survey that people connect with their modern definition of patriotism today. There's a lot more to discuss, but I just wanted to kind of set the table with those quick things.
So, Carl, before I go on, just one follow-up for John, which is that, so in terms of patriotism, we didn't try to define what patriotism was. We let the surveyors or the survey subjects define what they thought patriotism was. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. What the labels were. Do they participate in those activities? And what images do they connect with America? So yes, it was in the eyes of the voters that we surveyed.
So, Carl, what struck you about the poll?
Well, what struck me, I think that is the right way to approach it because, to some people, marching in a Veterans of Foreign War parade is patriotic, and to other people, recycling your garbage is patriotic because it's not an economic act, recycling. It's something you do for the greater good. So, and we're going to get some differences there. There was one thing that struck me about the poll. John Della Volpe and his team asked people, when they asked them, what do you consider patriotic? They also asked them, do you do these things yourselves? And so So even for gestures that Americans themselves do not take, they recognize that there's a patriotic aspect of it. And so, for instance, only 76% of the respondents in this poll acknowledge that flying the American flag is patriotic. And it seems to me that, if anything, that number is low. There's a partisan tinge there post January 6th, but only 48% of Americans actually flew a flag last year. So just about half flew the flag, but 3/4 of people acknowledge that it is patriotic. And likewise, 63% of Americans said that participation in community service is an expression of love of country. It is a patriotic thing to do, but only 34% did it. So what I see there is that there's room. I don't mean to sound too touchy-feely here, but Americans acknowledge there's room for self-improvement when it comes to patriotism and for what they do for their country. And it suggested to me that if you had a political system that was not bickering over these symbols, but actually, talking about them in a more inclusive way, you would get a higher percentage of people, not just flying the flag, but volunteering and doing these other things. So there's room. I saw room for growth and a latent desire to do more for their country.
John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interpretation of our nasty political fights that actually, talks about that actually kind of goes to us having a more common bond than 100 years ago, where if you lived in the North, you never went to the South. There were no interstates, there's no TV. Because really, like for there to be conflict and tension, it's like there has to be a common bond that holds you together, and there has to be some degree of proximity. It's like we don't have strong feelings, most of us, on conflicts in Sri Lanka, right? Because it's very distant from us. It's not in our worldview. So as we come closer together, the things that bind us make us angrier when other people disagree. So on the one hand, it is nice to see that there are so many things we hold in common, and that everyone seems to agree that the core of patriotism is doing something for the greater good. That said, those kind of commonalities, I think, are what make the types of things that we disagree upon more visceral.
So, John, let's talk about generations for a second, because one thing that struck me was how different the level of patriotism was, especially among young people. And I've seen other polls that sort of indicate the same thing. Are young people less patriotic than older Americans? And are they less patriotic than past generations at that sort of during that age level, if you will?
I think we really have to be careful with how we're defining it around that question, right? So they clearly are younger folks, being Gen Z and millennials, which together are Americans under the age of 40. They will represent about 40% of the 2024 electorate, okay? They are far less likely to consider themselves to be very patriotic as compared to their parents and grandparents. That wasn't always the case, Andy. When I started looking at young people right around the turn of the millennium and after September 11th, they were among the most patriotic of all Americans, okay? So we certainly have seen a significant double-digit drop in the number of younger people who self-identify as, quote, very patriotic. That's part one. The second thing is, though, they are, I think, kind of defining their own version of patriotism. And then perhaps that's one of the takeaways for me in this entire survey. When we look at younger people of color, Democrats versus Republicans, when we look at the segments that collectively define the electorate, we find many different visions of what it means to be patriotic. So, for example, younger people are far more likely to believe that protesting, demonstrating in the streets for racial justice is a patriotic act. Okay, the parents and grandparents may not be as likely to believe that. So I really do think it's in the eyes of the beholder. But I think kind of share the the insights from Sean and from Carl that there is still so much opportunity, to kind of reinforce this kind of love of country. And I do think they love their country just as much as others. They just show it in different ways.
Carl, you see it that way?
Well, John teaches, at Harvard. He's around these students and he loves them, and I'm touched by his optimism. But I tend to see it his way. But I think there are some worrisome trends too. If you're teaching, the conservatives can look at this data and say, well, if you're teaching young people that the American Revolution wasn't really fought for the right reasons, and if you're ignoring the Civil War to concentrate on Jim Crow, and when I say ignoring the Civil War, ignoring hundreds of thousands of soldiers died freeing the slaves. If you're looking at history, sort of overcompensating for how history was taught before. And you have a generation of people who aren't so sure about their country, it's going to manifest itself in this data. And that's why there's these fights over education now. And in both sides in our partisan, it's become a partisan issue, which I think is unfortunate. But there's some reason if I'm looking at this data, I'm a conservative. I think, well, of course, these young people don't want to fly their flag. They're not being taught that the flag is a good thing. So I tend to agree with John, but there's also some worrisome data here too.
We've got one question. I was asking about the whether the monuments sort of debate factored into any of our research, and I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that we looked at the flag per se. And Sean, it's sort of interesting. The flag has sort of been, in some people's view, sort of appropriated by the Republican Party, and I'm just wondering whether that is true, and if that's true of other symbols as well.
Well, I think to a degree, Democrats allowed that to happen during the Cold War period with the New Left and such, and valence issues that, like the flag burning debate, the Democrats were largely associated with, the First Amendment, which, by the way, I think the First Amendment take is the correct take, but you can see how that easily gets turned around. One thing I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, we'd asked was, we asked people what they think is patriotic, but then explored kind of the third person effect. Do you think other people believe this is patriotic, or do you expect, asking younger people, do you expect older people believe this is patriotic? Because I think that probably fuels a lot of this debate and distrust as well. Is we find these commonalities, but I'm guessing on things like the flag and whatnot, people don't expect there to be shared commonalities. I bet if you ask Republicans if they believe that young Democrats think flying the flag is patriotic, you'd get an overwhelming no response. There are differences, to be sure, but I don't think it would justify the overwhelming response we probably would have gotten.
Andy, can I add one thing there?
Please do.
Joe Biden is the president, and he ran for the nomination. He got a rough start in Iowa, an even rougher start in New Hampshire. But he thought, and he said, he read the stage directions. Now the calendar goes down south where there's lots of African-American voters, and I'm popular with them. And this proved to be true. But this was not a radical candidacy. He didn't run to the left of his main challengers, quite the opposite. And this is a president who, before he was president, and he was vice president and senator, ends every public speech by saying some version of, "And God bless America, and God protect our troops." So Joe Biden is a patriotic person in the most conventional way. He's 78. He's the only person who's ever been president or will be president who was born when Franklin Roosevelt was president. Roosevelt's his birth president. And in that way, he has old-fashioned expressions of patriotism, and he won. And so you had, although some people fear, as Sean was pointing out, that the flag has been politicized and one party emphasizing it, the other not, both candidates who ran for president in 2020 stood with the flag and by the flag and proudly displayed the flag. And it was, near record modern turnout for modern elections. So I wanted to add that.
So John, how did people, let's talk about these images you used a little bit. The flag was one of the images. What other images did you use, and which were the ones that sort of, I guess, sort of really showed the difference between the way certain people, maybe left and right, is the right way to look at it, view patriotism?
Yeah, so we showed 17 different images, and I think we might display some of them on the screen. And many of them, there were 30-point differences between the way Democrats or Republicans answered the question. So the question was, just this image, does it show you, does it connect with what you think is right about America or what's wrong about America? Okay, so as an example, overall majority of Americans believe, 2/3 of Americans believe that seeing a member of the military giving humanitarian assistance is what's right about America. A 20-point difference between that picture there, between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, flying the flag, 52% of Democrats think that shows what's right about America on a barn, 80% of Republicans. Okay, church. Is it what's right about America, what's wrong about America? A 30-point difference, again, between Democrats and Republicans, just as we saw a 30-point difference around the Floyd protests between what Democrats and Republicans say. So big images, and we talk about images and the appropriation of such. I think that really comes very, very clearly in these images that we showed.
So when you say there's a 30-point difference, going back to the church example, you mean that 30% more Republicans said that that's right about that's what's right about America than Democrats. Or are you saying that Democrats said that's what's wrong about America?
I'm focused on what's right about America. Okay, mm-hmm. So to be very clear, that's a great question, Andy. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, the answers were just in the neutral category. It just depends, right? It depends upon. We need to know more about the image. So right. This was a visceral reaction to measure kind of the intensity, mm-hmm. of the kind of connection with a particular image, right? Included everything from Wall Street to March for Our Lives to actually individual elected officials as well.
And what about elected officials? That's interesting. I mean, when people were saying what's right and what's wrong, I assume you showed Donald Trump.
Yeah, and 2/3 of Republicans think that's what's right about America. Right. 2/3 of Democrats thought image of buying what was right about America. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of in the eye of the beholder. We also showed Congresswoman Omar. We showed Vice President Harris as well. And for those, we also see very strong partisan differences.
So, Carl, we have someone asked about the word itself, patriot, and whether that word had in the questioner's phrasing, whether that's been hijacked by the Republicans. Is the whole idea of being a patriot now part of our partisan lexicon, and has it been sort of made political like everything else in our lives? I mean, mask wearing is, as we learn from this, is considered a patriotic thing to do. It seems like that's just something you might do to protect yourself, and it has nothing to do with patriotism. But that was politicized. So is the very word patriot become politicized?
Well, we're in the process, Andy, of looking at all these words and all the assumptions. If you read the New York Times 1619 Project, the people we were taught were patriots were talked about in a different way, as enslavers and other concepts like that. What's going on is a reevaluation in this country of who's a patriot and who isn't. The Robert E. Lee, is he a patriot? Most Americans would say no. George Washington, yes. Why? Because he didn't fight against his country, fought for his country. So some of these concepts endure, but we're in the process of considering them all. And, John Della Volpe's poll, the RealClear Opinion Research poll that John led, also got into critical race theory. And Americans, from the data that John got, it doesn't look to me like Americans know that much about critical race theory. It also, but it doesn't seem like their majority are horrified by it. asked about it without any prompting, 42% expressed support and only 36% opposition, with the rest no opinion. When critical race theory was explained to them, the theory in neutral language, support actually went up a little bit. So, Republicans who think that this is automatically a winning issue for them, the data doesn't show that. On the other hand, as Americans find out more about this, they're going to be making up their minds whether, if their school teacher is patriotic or not. Because, you ask a question like we did in this poll: do you support or oppose teaching K through public schools, K-12 public schools, about how the legacy of racism and Jim Crow remains embedded in modern day society through laws and institutions that were fundamental in shaping American society? That's what we asked. Support actually went up for that. It's not a majority, but it's a pretty good number. And so, on the other hand, if this thing is carried out in ways, if their 8-year-old comes home in tears and she's been, made to stand in a circle like they did in communist China during the Cultural Revolution and denounce herself for being white, those numbers aren't going to sustain themselves. So there's an opportunity for both parties here to deal with this issue correctly. There's also an opportunity for them to blow it. And that happens. We've seen that too.
Sean, what about the politics of critical race theory? It's a hot topic, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny, because I think the places, and maybe this is the way it should be, the places where critical race theory has a chance of being taught are the places where it would be the least controversial, blue cities and whatnot. The places where you're having the biggest fight over it, however, or the biggest backlash due to the places where it's not being taught. My school district out here in the suburbs of Ohio, at the last PTA meeting, had someone stand up. He's actually a former wide receiver for Ohio State, and give a big speech about how he didn't want critical race theory in the schools. There is no critical race theory in our schools out here. So the big question to me is, what about some of these purplish developing blue areas, places like Loudoun County, Virginia? Are those places where maybe Republicans get some mileage out of this issue? I don't know. But at the same time, I think for the most part, critical race theory, or what we call critical race theory, or what's been labeled it, probably isn't actually being taught in the places where there's the biggest fights over it.
So, John, how did you approach critical race theory in the poll? I think that's an interesting question, just from a methodological point of view, because as Carl said, there you did come up with the definition of what critical race theory was, and sort of tested that definition.
Yeah, and by the way, all the polling, including links to the crosstabs, are all available on the RealClearPolitics page, so folks can see that. So we had a series of questions. The first of which is, are you familiar with a variety of terms, of which critical race theory was one? Right. Then we asked, if you're familiar, how confident are you that you can describe it to a friend or family member? Okay, only American voters. When there's only about a third of the electorate who knows it and is confident that he or she can explain it, number one. Then we asked questions related to, do you support or oppose it being taught in schools with and without a definition? And Jonathan can show these, but importantly, we also provided a don't know, right? And we do see kind of the nuance and the subtlety that there is a significant amount of Americans who aren't familiar with it and need to learn more. So that's why, as Sean talked about, like those PTA meetings and these other kind of conversations are happening across the country are so quote, critically important. One of the more interesting things, I think, of this entire survey is we see, with the description provided here versus support without the description, we see overall significant improvement from the don't know to the support category across most categories, okay? Certainly among urban voters, certainly among blue state voters, among Democrats, et cetera. But the one group that didn't change their support of critical race theory, regardless of who they asked it, were actually the folks who have the biggest stake, parents of K through 12 students. 63% support critical race theory definition without knowing more about it, and about the same number of folks support it when we provide the definition. So that's the category that I'm most interested in watching, since they're the ones who obviously are going to be most directly, and their children, affected by it.
Yeah. So, I mean, is that a number you think that's likely to change, though? Or, I mean, I guess, can you? Is there any way to measure that? I mean, how firmly they believe that? Because, I will say that 6 months ago, I think that if you asked anybody what critical race theory was, as a matter of fact, we talked about it once on the podcast, and I had people saying, "What is this thing you're talking about?" Now I think everyone does seem to know, but it's the definition is certainly being hammered out in the press.
Yeah, and as Sean said, by both sides, right? One of the other interesting crossouts, we looked at like Democrats who watch a lot of MSNBC versus also don't. Same thing with Republicans. Mm-hmm. And for example, Republicans who aren't watching Fox are 14 points more supportive of it than Republicans who watch a lot of Fox. So we can see how much the media is influencing like so many of the conversations. But as the summer comes to an end, as these conversations begin to pick up, I think as school starts, this is certainly something that we can measure. And I do suspect that it is fairly elastic. It could change over time.
Well, Carl, we're almost out of time, but so I'm going to go to you and ask you to just to wrap this up for us. I mean, what do you think are, the most important takeaways from the poll? And also what's next for Real Clear Opinion Research?
I think the most important thing to me from this poll is that Americans want to be patriotic. It's the default position, but they don't want to do it if it compromises their political party or their other beliefs. They think they ought to do more, and they think they ought to do more than they're doing. That's what I got from the data. So again, there's an opportunity here, and the opportunity is for to use Lincoln's phrase, for politicians to appeal to their better angels. And it seems to me that this data shows that Americans are poised to respond to that. And the next poll we're going to do, we've been in the field already, and we'll be announcing it next week. We've got data on immigration and how Americans feel about that. Mm-hmm. And that, as you know, that's an issue I've covered many years and care a lot about. So I'm looking forward to writing about that and talking about it with John Della Volpe, Sean Trende, and you.
Great. Well, we're going to wrap it right there. That's a great place to end it. And you can read Carl's article on the poll, as well as see the top line results, as John said. Other analysis is available. It's all at RealClearPolitics.com. You click at the tab at the top of the page that's labeled Opinion Research. And you can also find out there about past polls we've done. And whenever there's a new poll, it always appears there. So check back often. I want to thank Carl Cannon, John Della Volpe, Sean Trende. We also have a podcast that runs on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, which you can find on the site as well. It's on Apple and other podcast platforms. We often talk about polling numbers there. Thanks to Aaron Waters, Liz Martin, who organized today's conference. Feel free to reach out to us at questions@realclearpolitics.com if you want to learn more about Real Clear Opinion Research. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks to John Sorensen, who produced today's event, and thank you for joining us. That wraps us up for today. Until next time, for Real Clear Politics and for Real Clear Opinion Research, I'm Andrew Walworth.